Okay, good evening, everybody. Are we all ready to learn about the Grail legends and what they have to do with the temple and the lodge? I am. Um, so, the chapter is Celtic Scotland and the Grail legends. So, this should be interesting. Um, I've always been interested in the Grail legends and read a lot of them many, many, many years ago. So, interested to see what Michael Bejant and Richard Lay have to say about it. So, let's just jump straight on into it, shall we? If in the years following Bannockburn an enclave of Templars did indeed settle in Argyll and intermarry with the clan system, the region would have constituted a natural habitat for them and a most congenial one. In certain respects, it might almost have represented something akin to a homecoming. The Templars were, of course, a legend in their own lifetime. In Scotland, however, and particularly in Argyll, there were other legendary antecedents with which the order, in the eyes of the populace, would have been identified. In effect, Argyll offered a context of legend into which the Templars would have been effortlessly incorporated. Toward the end of the 12th century, the first of the so-called Grail romances appeared in Western Europe. By the beginning of the 14th century, by the time of Bruce, that is, and then suppression of the temple, the Grail romances as a genre were still much in vogue and had spawned an immense corpus of collateral literature. The concept of chivalry, as expounded by such works, was then approaching its zenith. Christian rulers self-consciously aspired to the lofty models of Parsifal, Gawain, Lancelot, and Galahad, or at least sought to purvey such images of themselves to their people. Thus, for example, Edward I endeavored to portray himself as a latter-day Arthur, even to the point of holding round table jousts. Thus, on the day before Bannockburn, while the two armies aligned themselves for battle, Bruce and the English knight Henry de Bohun met in single combat, the kind of personalized duel to the death so celebrated in chivalric romance. The Grail romances, although condemned by ecclesiastical authorities elsewhere in Europe, enjoyed a particular currency in Scotland. Bruce, it must be remembered, was seeking to re-establish in Scotland a Celtic kingdom, whose traditions extended back through David I to the Dalriada, Dalriada, and the Grail romances contained an important Celtic element, a corpus of Celtic lore and legend not to be found in later literature issuing from Norman England or from the continent. In the form that we know them today, the Grail romances are a particularly hybrid genre reflecting a complicated process of cross-fertilization. As we have discussed in a previous work, they contain an important corpus of Judeo-Christian material concealed or disguised in elaborate dramatic form. But this material has been grafted onto a body of legend and saga which is uniquely Celtic. Long before the Grail itself appeared in literature, with its specifically Christian import, there were Celtic poems and narratives chronicling a chivalric quest for a mysterious sacred object endowed with magical properties. A remote castle with a crippled or impotent king, an infertile wasteland suffering from the same blight as its ruler. Thus, some recent scholars carefully distinguish between the Christian Grail of the latter, better known romances and the later better known romances and the pagan Grail of their precursors. And indeed, it was the confusion of the miraculous cauldron in the earlier works with the more nebulous Grail of the later works that led to the definition of the Grail as a cup, bowl, chalice, or vessel, rather than to the sangreal, the blood royal, to which it in fact referred. On to the foundations of the earlier Celtic sagas, then. The sagas of Cauldron and Wasteland and Castle Perilous, a Judeo-Christian superstructure, was added to produce what are now called the Grail romances. And this Judeo-Christian superstructure, significantly enough, is repeatedly associated with the Templars. Thus, for example, in Parzival, perhaps the single greatest and most important of all the Grail stories, Wolfram von Eschenbach portrays the Templars as guardians of the Grail and of the Grail family. Wolfram also claims to have heard the Grail story from a certain Quixote de Provence, I don't know, who can be identified as, oh, Quixote de Provence. Uh, anyway, a Templar scribe and propagandist. More telling still is the fact that the Grail romance known as the Parlevos, yeah, second only to Wolfram's version in significance, contains unmistakable allusions to the Order, not only in its depiction of knights in white mantles emblazoned with red crosses, presiding over a sacred secret, but also in the very tenor of its thought and values. The Parlevos abounds with a meticulous, detailed, and accurate knowledge of weapons and armor, of techniques of fighting, and characteristics of wounds. It is obviously the work not of a troubadour or romancier, but of a fighting man, and so pervasive is the Templar influence in it that the anonymous author is widely believed to have been himself a Templar. In such works as Wolfram's Parzival and the Parlevas, uh, yeah, the reader is confronted with a syncretic accretion of two diverse traditions, one Judeo-Christian, one Celtic, and the adhesive, so to speak, the metaphorical framework holding these two components together is implicitly or explicitly Templar. By Bruce's time, Celtic tradition, Grail mystique, and Templar values had fused into a single, often confusing amalgam. Thus, for example, there is the well-known Celtic cult of the head, the ancient Celtic belief that the head contained the soul, and that the heads of vanquished adversaries should therefore be severed and preserved. Indeed, the severed head is now regarded as one of the hallmarks of archaic Celtic culture. It figures perhaps most prominently in the myth of Bran the Blessed, whose head, according to tradition, was buried as a protective talisman outside London, face turned towards France. Not only did it protect the city from attack, it also ensured the fertility of the surrounding countryside and warded off plague from England as a whole. In other words, it performed functions strikingly similar to those performed by the Grail in the later romances. I don't know why I keep saying latter. It surfaces later as the so-called Green Man, the vegetation god and tutelary deity of fertility. At the same time, the Templars had their own cult of the head. Among the charges preferred against among the charges preferred against them, and one to which a number of knights pleaded guilty, was that of worshipping a mysterious severed head sometimes known as Baphomet. Moreover, when the officers of the French king burst into the Paris temple on 13 October 1307, there was found a silver reliquary in the shape of a head, containing the skull of a woman. It bore a label denoting it as Caput. What would that? It's Roman numerals. Let's see. That would be 58. But then there's a small m at the end. I don't know what that means in Roman numerals. So LVIII and then a small case m. So I don't know what the small case m means. But head 58M. This might at first seem a very grisly coincidence, but in the list of charges drawn up by the Inquisition against the Templars on 12 August 1308, there appears the following, quote, item, that in each province they had idols, namely heads. Item, that they adored these idols. Item, that they said that the head could save them. Item, that it could make riches. Item, that it made the trees flower. Item, that it made the land germinate. End quote. These attributes are so precisely as to be at times verbatim, the attributes ascribed by the romances to the Grail and by Celtic tradition to the severed head of Bran the Blessed. It is thus clear that the path it is thus clear that both the Grail romances and the Templars, despite their primary Christian orientation, incorporated crucial residues of the Celtic tradition. These residues, baffling and gruesome though they may appear today, would have struck a familiar atavistic chord in the Celtic kingdom Bruce was endeavoring to reestablish. Thus, although the Celtic prototypes from the Grail romances did not feature the Grail itself, at least under that name, other components of the later story were certainly present. The Grail itself made its debut in a long narrative poem entitled Le Conte de Grail by Chrétien de Troyes, writing in the last quarter of the 12th century. Sorry about my pronunciation on those things. Wolfram's Parzival and the anonymous Parleva, dating from a quarter of a century or so later, draw on material and sources of information to which Chrétien was not apparently privy, but it is still from Chrétien's poem that these works and all the other Grail romances ultimately, to one degree or another, derive. Little is known about Chrétien, and little can be gleaned except from the dedications to his work and internal textual evidence. What emerges is meager enough, but it would seem clear at least that Chrétien worked under the tutelage and sponsorship of aristocratic courts, namely the courts of the Counts of Champagne and of Flanders. These courts were closely associated with each other and were also associated with heterodox religious attitudes, including a skein of heretical Cathar thought. Both courts were also closely associated with the Templars. Indeed, some three-quarters of a century before Chrétien, the Comte de Champagne had been, or Champagne, had been a key figure in the creation of the order. Hugh de Payen, first Grand Master of the Temple, was a trusted vassal of Comte de Champagne, and seems consistently to have been acting on the Count's instructions. Subsequently, the Count himself, repudiating his marriage, was taken into the order, thus, in a curious paradox, became the vassal of his own vassal. Much of Chrétien's early work is dedicated to various members of the court of Champagne, and particularly to the Countess Marie. But his version of the Grail story, composed between 1184 and 1190, is dedicated to Philippe de Alsace, Comte de Flanders. Comte de Flanders. Chrétien states explicitly that the narrative of the Grail was originally recounted to him by Philippe, who then instructed him to weave whatever romance he could around it. Unfortunately, Chrétien died before he could finish the work completely, but in what exists of the poem there are a number of points of interest. For example, it is in Chrétien that Arthur's capital is named for the first time as Camelot, and Chrétien repeatedly designates Percival by a formula that will later be adapted by Wolfram and other romanciers, and will eventually come to figure prominently in later Freemasonry. the son of the widow. This formula concealed a meaning which was still legible in Chrétien's age, but was subsequently lost. Most important to note for our particular purpose is that Chrétien, in the Celtic elements of his poem, is drawing on some fund of information other than established English and Welsh sources. Not, of course, that he ignores those sources. On the contrary, he owes much to them. He relies heavily on Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, a quasi-legendary account written around 1138, which first brought Arthur to the public consciousness. He also relies heavily on such archaic tales as Peredur and other narratives from the Welsh Mabinogion. Lost my place. Welsh Mabinogion, but there are other aspects of Chrétien's poem which owe nothing to such traditional sources, aspects which are specifically and uniquely Scottish. Indeed, it is clear that Chrétien had some independent source of information about Scotland, and experts conclude it to be from Scotland that Chrétien derived certain key features of his poems, geography, and topography. Thus, for example, Chrétien's hero, Perceval de Gallois, might be supposed at first to come from Wales. In fact, however, the term Gaulois or Gallois was applied in Chrétien's time to natives of Galway in Scotland. The Grail Knights in Chrétien's poem defend Le Pour de Galvois, the gates of Galvois, this being the land on whose borders they operate. Scholars of the Grail romances concur that Galvois must be Galway. In Geoffrey of Monmouth there are references to Castellum Puellarum, which in some of the later Grail romances, but not Chrétien's, becomes the famous Castle Perilous. Writing in 1338, the commentator and translator Robert of Brunn says that Castellum Puellarum is in fact the real castle of Caerlaverock in Galloway. As one modern biography of Chrétien's observes, Robert of Brunn may well be repeating accredited tradition, for in his youth at Cambridge he knew the future King Robert the Bruce. In any case, Caerlaverock was only some 10 miles from Annan, the seat of the Bruce family, who had been made lords of Annandale by David I in 1124. The castles at Annan and Caerlaverock were both often said to have guarded the door to Galloway, although Chrétien does not speak specifically of Castellum Puellarum or Castle Perilous. He does speak of a Roche de Canguin, something like that, which, according to at least one scholar, derives from an embellishment of Caerlaverock. In Chrétien's poem, it is this site significantly enough that which garde le pour de Galvois. A lot of French stuff in here I'm having trouble with, sorry. In Chrétien's poem, Arthur's second residence after Camelot is called Cardul, something like that. Until 1157, the capital of Scotland was Carlisle, which is, in the days of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, was called Cardul, and then evolved into Carduil. Chrétien also mentions the religious site called Mont Dolorous. This is believed to be Melrose Abbey in Northumberland. founded in 1136 and known in Chrétien's time as Mons de los Roses. It was here that nearly 2 centuries later, Bruce's heart was to be buried. From this and much similar evidence, it is obvious that Chrétien, in whose work the Grail first appears, is grafting his specifically Christian concept of it onto a corpus of much older material, some of which refers very precisely to Scotland. But why should a romancier working under the patronage of the courts of Champagne and Flanders focus so pointedly on Scottish sites when the Judeo-Christian superstructure of his poem derived from very different sources? Chrétien claimed to have received the outlines of the Grail story from Philippe de Alsace, Comte de Flanders, who told him to make whatever he could of them, and Philippe's contacts with Scotland were numerous and close. As Lord of Flanders, he had extensive dealings with Scotland and a considerable knowledge of the country, its people, and their traditions. Indeed, throughout the 12th century, certain ties had been deliberately forged between Scotland and Flanders. During the reigns of David I, 1124 to 1153, and Malcolm IV, 1153 to 1165, there obtained a systematic policy of settling Flemish immigrants in Scotland. The newcomers were installed in large organized enclaves in Upper Lanarkshire, Upper Clydesdale, West Lothian, and the north of Moray. According to one commentator, the Flemish settlement seems a systematic attempt to implant in Upper Clydesdale and Moray, at the expense of local aristocracy and church, a new aristocracy. As we have seen, Bruce's own family is now believed to have been of Flemish, not Norman, descent. A familiar origin has been traced for such a similar origin has been traced for such other prominent Scottish families as Balliol, Cameron, Campbell, Comyn, Douglas, Graham, Hamilton, Lindsay, Montgomery, Seton, and Stewart. Some of these families have already figured in our story. They and others as well will figure even more prominently later. Sorry about that. Tried to inhale my hot toddy. The purpose of the Flemish settlement in Scotland seems to have been to build up urban centres in the country. Flanders had already become an urbanized, commercialized region with great trading cities such as Bruges and Ghent, straddling the mercantile routes to the Rhine, the Seine, and the British Isles. It also included in its territory Boulogne and Calais. The Scottish monarchy, needing the revenue to be obtained from town rents, looked to Flanders as a model of urban development. Flemish settlers were thus actively encouraged to come to the country and establish metropolitan centers on the Flemish pattern. They were welcomed, too, for their expertise in agriculture, in weaving, and in the wool trade. The association of Scotland and Flanders began with David I and Malcolm IV, continued through the reign of Malcolm's successor William the Lion. When William invaded England in 1173, he was reinforced by a Flemish contingent, a contingent sent to him by Philippe de Alsace, and in military matters as well as in urban development, the Scots learned from Flanders. In 1302, the burghers of the Flemish town of Courtrai rose in revolt. Using the so-called schiltrum formation, men formed in a square with long pikes anchored in the ground and pointed outwards. They managed to defeat a large and powerful French army. For the first time in Western Europe, Courtrai broke the hitherto invincible power of the mounted and armored knight. Bruce learned from the battle. It was precisely the Schiltrom formation that he deployed so successfully at Bannockburn, until the mysterious fresh force appeared on the scene to turn the tide. Okay. Um, and we saw that. Remember, I've referred this back to the movie Braveheart. We saw sort of what he's talking about there, where in the battles with William Wallace, they're using the long spears. He's kind of talking about that, but they were just doing it on the front line, like the front couple lines of their troops, not in squares, but still a very similar tactic. Anyway, there was much cross-fertilization and reciprocal influence between Scotland and Flanders. As a result of the influx of Flemish settlers, Scottish towns assumed certain distinctly Flemish characteristics, while elements of Scotland's ancient Celtic heritage found their way back to Flanders, where they surfaced in, among other things, the Grail romances. Once they had begun to evolve as a genre, the Grail romances were carried back to Scotland, where the original Celtic component in them would have been duly recognized and appreciated. It is not hard to imagine how congenial the exiled Templars would have found Scotland, this setting for the adventures of Grail Knights and fictionalized Templars. It was, so to speak, ready-made for them, presenting themselves as real-life Grail Knights. They could aid Bruce in his campaigns and be welcomed as chivalric saviors as well. Where else could they have found a climate so hospitable to survivors of the order wishing to secularize themselves, integrate themselves, and perpetuate themselves, safely insulated from their persecutors elsewhere? And that is not only the end of the chapter, but it's the end of the part. So we're going to go into part 2 next time, Scotland and a Hidden Tradition, the first chapter of which is the Templar Legacy in Scotland. So that'll be chapter 6, and we'll pick it up on Sunday. I don't do readings on Saturdays, so we'll pick it up Saturday, or Sunday. I just said that. So, yeah, anyway. So far, pretty interesting book. Thank you for joining me, and I will call this a session, and I'll be back in just a little bit after a short break, maybe 15 minutes, to play some Hogwarts Legacy, whatever you may feel about that. I'm still going to play it, so I'll catch you next time. There we go.
Prepare to die.
Whoops! I started typing, and it switched my screen.
Whoops.
Sorry about
I
that.
started typing.
and it switched my screen.
Whoops.
Sorry about
I
that.
started typing.
and it switched my screen. Sorry about that.
Prepare to die.